to real history. On Friday the 13th, a king captured the Templars, but not their gold. A tale of the Templar gold. The great tower of the Paris Temple rose like a colossal black sentinel against the bruised, rain-swept sky of 1306, its massive stone walls whispering of secrets, iron, and unimaginable wealth. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of melting beeswax, damp granite, and the faint, sweet aroma of old parchment rolls. At a massive oak desk sat Hugues de Perrot, the visitor of France, and the chief administrator of the Order's financial empire. His fingers, calloused from years of handling both broadswords and iron keys, carefully traced the long columns of a massive ledger. Hugues had been received into the Order as a mere boy of 18 by his own father. Since then, the temple had become his entire world, a world of solemn vows, silent prayers, and the relentless, rhythmic clinking of gold coins. Every tribute from the European preceptories, every coin paid in interest by desperate barons, and every ounce of silver harvested from the vast estates passed through his ledger. Behind him, the symbol of the Order, two poor knights sharing a single horse, a poignant reminder of their humble, impoverished origins, was carved into the dark wood of the mantelpiece. But poverty was now a ghost of the past. The Templars had become the world's first multinational corporation. They had engineered a revolutionary precursor to modern banking, transforming simple letters of credit into golden keys that unlocked the riches of Europe and the Levant. A pilgrim in London could deposit his gold, receive a slip of parchment guarded by encrypted ciphers, and reclaim his fortune in the sun-drenched streets of Jerusalem, safe from the daggers of highwaymen. They managed trade networks, collected crusading taxes for the Pope, and accumulated vast tracts of land, vineyards, and fortified castles. Yet, this golden network had spun a web of dangerous envy. King Philip IV of France, a cold, ruthless monarch whose treasury was a gaping, empty void, was drowning in royal debt. He had already expelled the Jewish populations and the Lombard merchants, seizing their fortunes to fund his endless wars against England, but it was not enough. Only a few months prior, during a violent uprising over the debasement of the royal coinage, Philip had been forced to flee his own palace and seek physical sanctuary behind the iron-girded gates of the Paris Temple. As the angry mob roared outside, the king had walked the quiet, vaulted corridors of the fortress, his eyes lingering on the heavy iron chests of bullion. It was a fatal moment of revelation. Philip realized that while his crown was bankrupt, his silent, tax-exempt creditors were sitting on an empire of gold. The seed of destruction had been planted in the fertile ground of royal greed. As the seasons turned, the shadows in the royal court grew longer and more menacing. Philip, guided by his fiercely loyal and cunning minister, Guillaume de Nogaret, began to weave a tapestry of lies. They gathered rumors from bitter, cast-out brothers and spun them into monstrous accusations of devil worship, heresy, and dark rituals. By late September 1307, a suffocating tension hung over France. Secret, sealed parchment packets had been dispatched by royal couriers to every bailiff and sheriff in the kingdom, bearing the king's seal and a terrifying command. They were to be opened simultaneously on the night of the October 12th, under pain of death. On that very night, as a thick, freezing fog rolled off the river Seine, swallowing the cobblestone alleys of Paris in a ghostly shroud, a quiet panic erupted inside the temple walls. Gérard de Villiers, the enigmatic preceptor of France, stood in the flickering light of a single tallow candle. He had received a whispered warning from a high-ranking contact close to the royal court. The king's trap was about to spring, and the destiny of the order hung by a thread. Under the cover of darkness, while the rest of Paris slept in ignorant peace, a desperate operation was set in motion. Muffled hooves clattered softly against the wet cobblestones as Gérard de Villiers organized a hasty caravan of 50 horses. Quietly, they loaded heavy leather bags and wooden crates. It was the mobile heart of Hugues de Pyrot's central treasury, not just gold and silver bullion, but the sacred relics, the ancient archives, and the secret transaction books of the order. They knew that if the king's men laid hands on these ledgers, the entire transnational banking network would collapse, and their brothers would be utterly defenseless. At the same time, miles to the west, the ancient Atlantic port of La Rochelle lay quiet under a blanket of ocean mist. For over a century, since Eleanor of Aquitaine had granted them duty-free mills, La Rochelle had served as the Templars' greatest maritime gateway. It was here that their main fleet lay anchored. As the tide began to turn, 18 wooden galleys creaked against the stone docks. Silent, cloaked figures loaded the ships in a frantic race against the clock. No carts of straw, as later romantic legends would fabricate, but heavily guarded packages containing the lifeblood of the temple. By the time the first pale light of dawn began to pierce the gray horizon, the 18 ships had slipped their moorings, sailing out into the treacherous, churning waters of the Bay of Biscay, vanishing into the eternal mist of history. Friday, October 13th, 1307, dawned cold and unforgiving. In the pale gray twilight, the silence of the Paris temple was violently shattered. The heavy thud of iron-clad boots echoed through the courtyard as royal soldiers, led by Nogaret, smashed through the oak gates with heavy iron axes. Hugues de Pyrot was dragged from his bed in chains, his white mantle bearing the red cross torn from his shoulders. Across the kingdom, hundreds of knights, priests, and sergeants were simultaneously seized in their beds. They were thrown into dark, damp dungeons, accused of unspeakable heresies, denying Christ, spitting upon the crucifix, and worshipping a mysterious bearded idol known as Baphomet. But as Nogaret's men rushed down into the deep, subterranean vaults of the Paris temple, torches held high, the flickering light revealed a devastating truth. The great iron chests were gone, the massive stone pedestals were empty. Only dust, cobwebs, and a few stray scraps of parchment remained in the dark, cold corners of the vaults. The king's grand raid had captured the men, but the legendary treasure of the Templars had slipped through his fingers. A frantic, desperate search was launched across the ports of France, but the sea kept its secrets, and the royal treasurers found far less gold than they had desperately anticipated. Months turned into years of darkness and pain. In the subterranean cells of Paris, the inquisitors used horrific torture, stretching limbs on the rack, applying red-hot irons to the bare soles of feet, and using slow starvation until many broken knights confessed to whatever sins were shouted at them. Yet the mystery of the missing gold remained a festering, unhealed wound for the French crown, which was still drowning in financial ruin. In June 1308, a dramatic turning point occurred in the vaulted halls of Poitiers. A captured Templar knight named Jean de Chalon stood before the papal inquisition. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he looked upon the assembly of cardinals. Under oath, de Chalon delivered a testimony that sent a shockwave through the courtroom. He revealed that the senior leadership had indeed foreseen the king's betrayal. He testified that he had personally met Gérard de Villiers, fleeing Paris with 50 horses, and that he had heard the news that Villiers had successfully put to sea from La Rochelle with 18 boats, carrying the entire treasury of Hugues de Pyrot. This was the first official confirmation of the Great Escape, a recorded testimony that would fuel centuries of speculation. While the French crown scrambled to trace the phantom fleet, the tragic human cost of the trial was being paid in the damp, claustrophobic dungeons of Chinon Castle. There, Hugues de Pyrot lay broken, his spirit crushed by the endless threat of torture. In August 1308, 3 papal cardinals arrived to interrogate him. Desperate to save his life and restore his standing with the Church, de Pyrot made voluntary confessions. He spoke of the secret, bizarre initiation rites, claiming that they were merely symbolic, words spoken from the lips but not from the heart. He was the only leader to confess to seeing the mysterious bearded idol head in Montpellier. Believing their repentance, Pope Clement V issued the famous Chinon parchment, granting plenary absolution to Hugues de Pyrot and the Grand Master Jacques de Molay, intending to reform and protect the order under ecclesiastical authority. But the parchment was a fragile shield. Under intense threatening pressure from King Philip, who threatened to split the church, the Pope's defense collapsed. The Chinon parchment was misfiled, lost deep within the labyrinth of the Vatican secret archives for nearly 700 years, leaving the prisoners to their terrible fate. In 1310, 54 brave Templars who dared to retract their forced confessions were dragged to a field outside Paris and burned at the stake as relapsed heretics. Hugues de Pyrot, silent and forgotten, was condemned to life imprisonment, dying in a dark cell sometime after 1321. A man who once held the keys to the wealth of Europe, reduced to a shadow in the dark. The Order of the Temple was officially dissolved in 1312. By the papal bull Ad Providam, all their vast lands and commanderies were to be transferred to their rivals, the Knights Hospitaller. But the physical gold and liquid currency had vanished. To even take possession of the French lands, the Hospitallers were forced to pay King Philip a staggering sum of 200,000 livres tournois as compensation for the costs of the trials. The treasure of the Templars had been completely drained into the royal French estate, leaving only cold stone walls and empty vaults behind. Yet the ultimate key to the mystery lay not in the fields of France, but on the sun-drenched, war-torn island of Cyprus. Since the fall of Acre in 1291, the central archives of the Templars, the master ledgers containing every deposit, every mortgage, and the exact manifests of their shipping fleets, had been stored in their Cypriot headquarters. Though the knights on the island were eventually arrested and many died in prison, these priceless records remained intact, locked away in the ancient libraries of Famagusta, waiting for a future that would never come. The final tragic curtain fell in August 1571. The Ottoman Empire had unleashed a massive invasion force upon Venetian-controlled Cyprus. For 11 grueling months, the fortress of Famagusta held out under the heroic command of the Venetian governor, Marco Antonio Bragadin. Starving out of gunpowder and desperate to save the remaining civilians, Bragadin surrendered on August 1st, 1571, under a solemn promise of safe passage. But the promise was a cruel illusion. The Ottoman commander, Lala Mustafa Pasha, flew into a violent rage. Bragadin's ears and nose were brutally severed. He was paraded through the city in humiliation and flayed alive, his skin stuffed with straw and hoisted upon the masthead of Mustafa's personal galley. What followed was a savage massacre of the Christian population and the systematic plundering of Catholic churches, schools, and libraries. During this mindless destruction, the Ottoman soldiers set fire to the ancient vaults of Famagusta. The central archives of the Knights Templar, the final complete records of their vast financial empire, were cast into the roaring flames. As the heat cracked the ancient stone walls, centuries of financial secrets, shipping routes, and ledger entries turned to swirling, black ash, drifting out over the deep blue of the Mediterranean Sea. The smoke of Famagusta permanently sealed the history of the Templar gold. Over the centuries, wild legends would rise from those ashes, claims of Rosslyn Chapel's secret vaults, or 18 ghost ships carrying the Holy Grail to the ends of the earth. But the real mystery of the missing wealth was not written in the occult or the esoteric. It was written in the desperate greed of a bankrupt king, the silent courage of a broken visitor in a dungeon cell, and the tragic fire of a 16th century war that burned the truth to ashes. All that remains are the empty, silent vaults of the Paris Temple, keeping their secrets forevermore. If you enjoyed today's return to the Middle Ages, I'd be truly grateful for your like. It's the best way to let me know that these stories are worth making. I'm already preparing the next chapter for you, so if you don't want to miss it, consider subscribing. I'll see you next week.